Hello, this is Mr. Turek, and today I'm going to walk you through some basic portrait adjustments that you can make. These aren't exactly universal, but I'm just going to do them to a photo of me to kind of show you the basics, and then you have to be judicious with where you apply them, because not every portrait needs all of these edits, and not every portrait serves the same function. So I'm going to open a picture of me, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a Photoshop file because I'm going to be making a lot of edits to it. So save it as a Photoshop file, give it a name, portrait basics. Make sure you know where you save it, and then save often so that if you ever make a mistake, you can go back and open the original file, or go back and revert this file. All right, the first thing you should probably do is crop your image. And to crop your image, you're just going to go to the crop tool over here in the toolbox. And when the crop bounding box opens, you can just sort of move that around and kind of crop in on your image. Bring it in just a little bit. When you're all done, you can double click on it to confirm it. You can hit the enter key, or you can click on the check mark at the top. I took this image with the flash turned on, and I have a little bit of redeye. So to zoom in, I can hit Ctrl+, and then hold down the space bar to move around. And that's going to be really handy because we're going to be zooming in and out to look at our image up close and from far away. To fix redeye, it's really easy. Just go to your spot heal brush tool and click and hold. And the very last tool is the redeye tool. And the reason they make this tool its own tool is because, let's say you have a group photo and you have a bunch of redeye in it. This is a handy way to just sort of click on an eyeball and instantly fix redeye. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my layer, and I'm going to use the blur filter to smooth out some of my skin. So I'm going to go down to the layer panel, and to copy a layer you can click and drag it to the new layer button to copy it, or you can hit Ctrl+J. Or you can right click on it and just click on the copy layer option. On that top layer, you're going to convert it to a smart filter. So you're going to go to Filter, Convert to Smart Filters. Okay, and then you're going to add a bit of a blur to it. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur, and I'm going to use Surface Blur. And you can kind of use whatever you want. You can give it kind of a tiny radius here. Set the threshold low. And the thing about surface blur is that it leaves some of the detail in there, which we might want later. And if you don't like this kind of blur, there's tons of different kinds of blurs. Usually you do this with the Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur is the same thing, except it's a bit more brutal. It just sort of blurs everything. Gaussian blur, you would only need about 2-3 pixels worth of blur. And that gets rid of a lot of the details. So if you want some of those details to stay in the variation of the pigment of your skin, you want to do a different kind of blur. Click OK. And then we're going to add a layer mask to this blur. So go down to the layer panel, and then you're going to click on Add Layer Mask. And for this layer mask, you're going to invert the layer mask. So you're going to invert it in the Properties panel. Click Invert. And instead of blurring everything, we're just going to blur the parts of the skin that we want to be smooth. So I'm going to switch to my brush tool. I'm going to make sure that my layer mask is selected in my layer panel, and I'm going to make sure that I'm painting with white as my foreground color, and I'm going to set the opacity to 100%. Make sure my brush is 0% hardness and fairly large. And I'm just going to paint on the areas where I want the skin to be kind of smooth from the blur. And you're going to notice that it instantly smooths out my skin. Because we set the blur kind of low, it's conveniently just going to blur it enough to hide some of those imperfections, some of that texture. All right, we don't want to blur anything around the eyes too much. We don't want to blur any detail in the lips. We just want to blur the basic areas of the skin. All right, one of the more basic adjustments people make to their photos is with just the levels or the curves of the whole photo. Adding those kinds of adjustment layers allows you to control the basic, light-dark relationship. So if you go to Adjustments, New Curves layer, from here we can sort of, bring the white in a little bit to increase the contrast. We can turn up the midtones just a little bit or turn them down if we think they're too intense. Okay. And that just sort of smooths everything out for us. A really common adjustment is the gamma under exposure. You go to the exposure adjustment layer. You can turn the camera down just a little bit. And you can notice the difference here. Just sort of makes everything a little bit darker, a little bit more intense. You can also decrease or increase the exposure. You think it's overexposed. That's a really common edit. Another common edit is dodge and burn. Dodge and burn are pretty straightforward. Go over here in your toolbox. The dodge tool makes things lighter. The burn tool makes them darker. And the way it works is pretty straightforward. It behaves like a brush. You can go up here and you can adjust the size of the brush. But you can designate which range of values or tones it's going to affect. So if you set it to the midtones, it's only going to affect those colors that are sort of grayish or in the middle. Highlights are going to affect the bright white colors. So let's set it to highlights. And make sure you work with the exposure below 30%. These tools are really sensitive. What we're going to do is going to make our brush just a little bit bigger. That can kind of make those pop. And then we can switch to the burn tool here and we can just turn down some of these highlights. So I'm going to make a large brush. I'm going to switch it to highlights. Turn the exposure way, way down. About 18% there. If I click and drag over those areas, it's just gonna darken them just a little bit. Okay, and that's usually what you do for adjusting a portrait. You just dodge and burn a little bit. You smooth out the skin. Another really common edit is removing blemishes. So if you want to do that, we're going to make a snapshot of all these layers here. And to do that, you're going to hit Shift, Ctrl, Alt, and E. And that's just going to make like a top layer that's a picture of all the layers below it. And we're going to zoom in here. And we're going to use the spot healing brush tool. The way this tool works is if you have like a blemish, it just sort of takes the surrounding pixels and it fills in the area you paint. So if I want to get rid of this mole here, I just click to paint it away. And I can click and drag to paint away multiple areas. And this is pretty handy for areas like this where it's sort of mottled and inconsistent. Areas like this where it's mixed, like let's say I wanted to get rid of that. It's not quite going to work. It doesn't know what to fill it in with, so it's filling it in with my mouth over here. So for these kinds of areas, like let's say I wanted to get rid of this, I would use my stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool is over here. The way it works is you take a sample of one area and you paint with it elsewhere. So I'm going to sample up here, and I'm going to paint down here. So to sample, you hold down the Alt key, and you click once to sample. And then you're going to notice as I hover over here, it's like I'm painting with this And it works just like a brush. You know, you can set the edge hardness however you want. You can set the opacity however you want. Usually you paint with the soft brush at 100% opacity if you want to cover it up. And we can just sort of gently paint over these hairs here to hide that area. This is really handy for areas like this where I want to get rid of, say, you know, my unibrow or whatever. Get rid of these highlights. Okay, it's really handy. All right. Most of these edits I wouldn't do to all my photos. I would just do maybe one or two of them depending on what I felt like a certain photo needed, and even then I would be pretty gentle with these edits. It's really, really dramatic and really obvious when you make these kinds of edits. So please don't go overboard and make the skin like super smooth and make the eyes like super bright white like I did. Just do it real subtle, and that usually does the trick. That makes it look the best. And again, here's what it looked like before, and here's where we're at now. So I smoothed out some of the skin, did a bunch of contrast stuff, and got rid of some extra hair.